So kia ora everyone, my name's Guy Redding, I'm from the Ākina Foundation, based in New Zealand, in Wellington. This is Chris O'Neill, my colleague, and we'll be hosting this afternoon. So this session is on supporting your ventures to measure their impact. So, yesterday we looked at how you can measure your own impact as accelerators and incubators, but this one is focused on how you can support your ventures to measure their impact, so that being the key distinction. So first of all, I guess a question for you for the floor is, why is impact management and measure important? What are some of the reasons why people think impact measurement and management is important for ventures? Key part of being a social enterprise is you have a business model, so you're a social enterprise, you're selling a product or service, you're aiming to be financially self-sustainable over time, maybe not immediately, but also another key aspect is not just to have a good financial and business model, but also an impact model. So social enterprises are explicitly aiming to maximize community benefit, and social and/or environmental purpose is primary to the organization. Some other reasons for measuring impact. So it helps you with strategic planning. If you're reflecting on the impact that you're having, the activities you're doing, the activities that you're involved in, then it allows you to improve what you're doing over time and improve those activities, get rid of those activities or outcomes that aren't working. It allows you to prove to donors, to philanthropic funders, to impact investors that you're actually worth supporting, that you are having a social and/or environmental impact. It's also a way of educating others that are working in the same space that might want to do similar things or learn from what you're doing. Increasingly, governments are commissioning for social impact bonds, for example, so it's a business opportunity there to contract with government or with corporates to do work to expand your activities. And of course, in this day and age, you've got to link to the SDGs. The funders, the donors, the impact investors want to see a clear line of sight between the activities of your organization, the outcomes and impact you're achieving, and one or more of the SDGs.
So one of the things we spend a lot of time talking to our social enterprises about is thinking about what is the problem that they're actually trying to solve. Because a lot of people turn up, and you may have had this experience too, where they're clear that they want to make a difference in the world, they want to make the world a better place, and they sort of think they know what it is, but they can't really distill it down. And sometimes they're thinking about the symptoms, not the cause as well, right? So let's think about homelessness. Why do we end up with homeless people in our cities? Is there ever a relationship between some of these things? So these can be quite complicated problems, right? Complicated systems. And what we often see is social entrepreneurs turning up and saying, well, I want to treat the symptoms of this problem. And sometimes that's okay, but the first challenge we put to social entrepreneurs is asking them, well, are you clear that you're treating a symptom versus the cause? And in the examples you've got today, that'll be something to explore and think about. Is this venture that you're looking at treating the symptom of the problem or the root cause? And where do you think they might be wanting to give some of that attention? So when you're thinking about the work that you're about to do, and when you're thinking about working with ventures, is what is the link between where the person is that they're working with now and where they want to get to? So who knows Tom's Shoes? A couple of people who can tell me. Wow, almost everybody. Great, good example. So the primary argument for Shoes is around health. What happens to young kids when they get sick? What can't they do? They can't go to school. What happens to kids who can't go to school? They don't get as good an education. What happens to kids who don't get as good an education? Yep, limited access to good jobs. Yep, absolutely. And what happens because of that? Yep, they can't afford things, so there's maybe some poverty stuff, there's maybe some health stuff, long-term health stuff. So what you've just done is you've just done an impact model, like in that journey that you went from of shoes, sickness, education, long-term change. So this is actually a really simple concept. You know it already, and it's something that your ventures know, but often it's about asking these questions and helping them understand. So the second thing that we're asking social entrepreneurs is not just are you clear on what it is that you're doing, but is it the right thing? Is giving children shoes the right thing? Some would argue, well, again, it's treating the symptom, not the cause. We have to ask the question, why can't these children afford shoes? Or what are the cultural reasons that they might not be wearing shoes? So we might have actually completely misunderstood the problem here. or we might be actually trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist as well. So what we're thinking about with an impact model is the link between, is it a good approach, and the good thing that you want to have happen out of that. And the way we like to think about that is thinking about shooting a basketball hoop. You've got to know where you're starting from, and you've got to know where you're trying to get to. But there's actually a really predictable way to get from A to B. Now, you're not always going to hit the basketball, but as long as you throw the basketball in right arc to get it into the hoop, it lands there. So what we're looking for is, what is that formula, what is that plan, what is that pattern that enables us to go from where we think things are now to where we want them to be eventually? Can you kind of explain that using some kind of logic? So we're going to show you two different versions of how you can create an impact model or an impact logic. This is the simpler version that is really useful if people are just getting started in impact modeling. You don't want to overcomplicate it. You just want 4 boxes that they can fill out. And what we're looking for here is, what's the activity that they're undertaking? Let's use Tom's shoes as one that we can kind of unpick. So what is the activity that Tom's shoes is undertaking? So they're providing shoes to people. Yep. Absolutely. And so what is the impact on people? What is the immediate outcome of that on people or the planet? People have shoes, so health comes later, right? So what we're looking for is, what is that first step? And often that first step is something really countable or really easy to see. It can be harder when you're working in areas like self-confidence for people, but often with a product or service, you can actually count and you can say, well, we trained 12 people, or we sold 12 shoes, or we delivered X amount of drinking water to people. And after we get that immediate output, we get an outcome. So what starts to change in the medium term? So now this kid has shoes on his or her feet. What comes next? What's the kind of medium term in the next year or so change? They go to school? Yeah. So we might have something around they'll attend school more often. Again, something that we can probably measure. But over the long term, it gets a little bit more difficult to measure. We might be able to measure that kid 6 months out, 12 months out, but actually tracking down that kid in 8, 10, 12 years' time might be really hard. So we're starting to enter the realm of assumptions and other evidence sources like academic studies. And then the long-term impact. So what are Tom's telling us that's changing in the world eventually? So access to education is probably happening in the short term, but if we look 20 years down the track, what are we seeing? So this is our big goal that our enterprise is trying to achieve, but really hard for us to prove that, right? We helped a kid get education, and now we've helped reduce poverty in a country. That's a huge leap and impossible for us to document, impossible for us to prove. But what we can do is we can look at evidence. So, for example, you can look at the British government has a study that shows people in long-term employment have much better health outcomes. So you can rely on that kind of external data and say, well, look, we can show that the kids stayed in school, and then we can show you a bit of data that says kids who stay in school longer do better economically. And then we can show you this other piece of data that says, well, kids that do better economically do better in their health as well. And by drawing this thread through that, a very simple thread, we can actually show the logic of how we got all the way from giving a pair of shoes all the way to changing a country. Now, what's worth touching on very quickly is the concept of unintended consequences. So the reason we have Tom's shoes is because it's a really great example of digging into unintended consequences. What do you think happens when you put 20,000 shoes into a community? So all the people who repaired shoes no longer need to repair shoes because suddenly there are all these new shoes. People who used to sell shoes, well, they've got no customers because the customers are saying, well, we don't need shoes anymore. So actually what Tom's learned quite early on was you can't just go in and dump massive quantities of shoes. And there are really great examples in the water and sanitation space as well, where people haven't understood the community that they're going into, and they've thought they've understood the problem, but they really didn't. So the thing we always challenge our entrepreneurs to think about is, what are those unintended consequences? What else might happen that's a negative effect of what you're doing? And what compromises might you be making within that? One of my favorite examples of compromises is thinking about say a social enterprise cafe, which is the top 10, we always have people coming telling us they want to start a cafe. And the challenge I put in my workshops is, well, if you're running a social enterprise cafe and the purpose is to train young people and get them into employment, should you use free-range eggs or not? So what if I told you that you could train 2 more people if you used caged hens? Would you prioritize the people or would you prioritize the hens? And I think you nailed it for me, which is that it really depends on the context, doesn't it? Because if your purpose is purely to train as many people, then maybe you need to be really clear that your impact is on people. Your impact is not on the environment. But on the other hand, if your purpose is to train young people in sustainable practices, then of course you would have to stick with using free-range hens. So really, like, digging in with people and challenging them on their impacts is really, really important, because it helps bring clarity not just to their impact model, but also to their business model, because they're going to have to make decisions in their business model that are really informed by the impact model. There is a lot of complexity between linking your activities and your outcomes, and we've touched on some of that. And also during this week, words like attribution and contribution have come up. Attribution is where you can clearly say, this thing happened because of what we did. So, you could say, there's a nail, and I'm hammering that nail into a piece of wood. Really easy to clearly see the relationship there, right? Like, I can clearly claim that relationship. But when you're dealing with systems that have lots of interrelated parts, actually, you probably want to think more about, how am I contributing to this? I was talking to the education department in New Zealand recently, and we were talking about what makes a difference in education. And they said their biggest frustration was that actually the work they did inside the classroom was one of the lowest contributors to success of young people. Actually, it's the financial situation, whether there's domestic violence in the family, whether there's people who are sick within the family. There are all these other things. So people think kids go to school, they get an education, and they come out. But actually, it's so much more complicated. The actual work that happens within the school is only one small part of that. So they are only a contribution to the success and ultimate outcome of all of that. So think about that too for your entrepreneurs. Make sure they're not over-promising, because the last thing you want to do is say, well, we absolutely claim that, and somebody turns around and goes, well, actually the only reason that kid made that change in their life was because this other program was supporting them. So think about how they're working in an ecosystem.
Thanks, Chris. So how do we know what outcomes to measure in terms of what our activities and our program is? This is a process that you can follow through to sort of measure your outcomes and determine which outcomes are the most important to you. So first of all, it's really important to talk to your stakeholders, the people that you want to sell your product or service to. You need to know whether there's a big enough problem for you to fix, for you to address, whether people want to buy that product and service, and whether they also have the ability to pay for that product or service. So that's really important. The first step is to talk to those stakeholders, get your field team out there, interviewing people, surveying people. Once you've got that information and data from your field team, sit down with your field team and your other staff members and form an internal working group to work through what the activities and outcomes you're seeking to achieve. So for example, write down all of the outcomes that you expect to achieve from the activities and programs that you're running. You can then group those outcomes into what Chris was explaining, short-term outcomes from your activities, medium-term outcomes, and long-term outcomes. Some people might call the short-term outcomes more outputs. So it might be, for example, the number of people you've trained to sell your product, or the number of focus group discussions you've had. So those are more outputty. But then you get into, once you've been through that process, you're getting into those medium-term to long-term outcomes. You try and identify a clear link between the activities you're doing, the short-term outcomes or outputs that you're seeking to achieve, what then that happens more in the medium term, and then what happens in the long term. But not all outcomes are born equally. Some outcomes are going to be more important for the final impact that you're driving towards than others. So remove any of those outcomes that are not seemingly linked to your long-term impact that you're looking for. Similarly, go back to your activities, and if there are activities that don't have a clear line of sight with short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes, then you've got to question the relevance of those activities And those are the ones you might want to amend or drop or bring in new activities. So once you've been through this process of identifying the short-term, medium-term, long-term outcomes, and that you have identified the most important ones for those are your priority outcomes. Add outcomes if there's a gap in that logic, as I said. So if you've got a process where you're making a big leap of faith between activities and longer-term outcomes, you've got some magic happening in there. So you need to avoid the magic and avoid the sparkles. There needs to be, well, we do this activity and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. The next stage this is an example of a theory of change. So a little bit more complex than the one we had earlier. So the example here is running a parenting program for preschool children. So the people that you're working with, the stakeholders, are the parents and the children. In the short term, what you're hoping for is that parents gain the tools to work and sit with their children. They gain the confidence as well of working with their children. They make more positive time in the medium term to spend with their children. They read to their children more. And also through working in groups with other parents, they gain more confidence and make friends. The long-term outcomes is that you've got stronger family relationships from them spending more positive time with their children. And you're seeing an improvement through the reading program with better cognitive development for those children. And the parents, because they're making friends, they have a stronger support network. The long-term impact is improved education outcomes for children. So then, as I said, if you've got lots of magic and sparkles going on in between these activities, you've got to rethink those activities and outcomes, so that you're not having a big leap of faith between the activities you're doing and the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve in the long term. Some of those activities and outcomes are more important than others, so as we said, so work out what the golden outcomes are, as we like to call it. What's the golden thread? So, for example, here, it could be that the parents gaining more confidence in working with their children means that they're reading to their children more. That increases the cognitive development, and that improves education outcomes for children. So that's the key program logic that you want to monitor and evaluate over time. Okay, well, thanks everyone. Enjoy your afternoon tea.